Hey guys, how's it going? In this tutorial I'm going to show you how data binding works in Angular. So let's start off with the most simple method of data binding, which is string interpolation. So string interpolation is a form of one-way data binding, and it provides an easy way to insert the contents of a property in the component class to the template. So in this example I have a property called title with what is string interpolation as a string here, and in the template I have a h1 tag with title being interpolated, and I'm using the syntax of these two curly brackets, and it then results in this page here. And it's a really useful part of Angular, being able to do string interpolation. So we can change the value of this title property to hello world, for example, save this, and we get the new updated content here. And we didn't have to change the template at all, because we just changed the value of the property and it's then updated in the UI here. So that's just a simple example with a string. We can also do this with numbers. So random number of type number is equal to 100. We can then type in number here, save this. Random number, save this, and we now get this number being shown in the UI. And the reason this is because string interpolation works with any data type that JavaScript can cast to a string. So it's not necessarily just strings that you can interpolate into the UI. Okay, so let's try a more advanced example. Let's create a property called book of type any, and we'll set this to an object which will have a title of type string, which is equal to some book name. Actually, that's not working. Some book name, author here, and an ISBN number, 123. There we go. So now let's try and use string interpolation to display some of these properties in the UI. So let's go to the template, let's delete this, and let's create a h1 tag for the book name, and we can use string interpolation here with curly brackets, and we can type in the object name, which is book, and then dot title, which is what we called it, right? Title, yeah, title. Save this and go to the front end, and we get some book name. So string interpolation works with strings that are in objects, which is great. And we can also do the same thing for the author. So book.author, save that, and we now get the author name there. And we can do the same thing with the ISBN number. And there we go. So string interpolation is a very simple concept, but an incredibly powerful tool in Angular. Now let's talk about property binding. So what is property binding? Property binding is when we set the value of an element's attributes using properties defined in the component class. What this means is that we are able to pass data from the class to the template. So now we're going to go over a few basic examples. So I'm going to remove this content here. That was just placeholder content. And I'm going to create an image tag here. And its source I'm going to set. Well, first things first, I'm going to surround this source attribute in square brackets, which tells Angular that we are using property binding on this source attribute. And within the quotes, we can put a variable from the component class. So I'll put image source. Okay, and now we have to go to the component class, and I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to create a property called image source. Set that to a string, And now let's go and find an image. So I'm going to go and find, let's just search wallpaper. And let's get this image, for example. I'm going to copy image address, and I'm going to set image source to this address. And now save. So if we now serve this application using ngserve. Okay, so once the development server is up and running, we can go to localhost 4200. And there we go, we have this image. So that's pretty cool. So we were able to set the source of this image to a property in our component class, which was here. So we can now change this image by changing the property in the component class. So let's search for another wallpaper, for example. Let's search for another one. Images. Let's find an interesting one. This one's pretty cool. So I'm going to do copy image address. I'm then going to change this address here. And now save that. And go back to the application. And we can now see we have the new image here. Okay, so let's try something a bit more practical. So let's create a button. And let's type in click me. Save that. And you see we have a button here. So let's say we want to set the disabled attribute to a property in the component class. We can set this to is button disabled, and in the component class we have to create a property in the component class called is button disabled, and we'll set this to true and save this and save the HTML file, and we can now see that the button is disabled. So, and if we change the value to false, it shouldn't be disabled. And we can now see that this button is enabled. Great. So let's try something a bit more interesting. How about an input? So if we create an input with type text, and we want to set the value attribute, so let's surround that in square brackets and set this to a TypeScript expression. So we can now set this to a property in our component class. So I'll say input value and save that, and I'll create a property in the component class called input value of type string. Okay, so we can set this to hello world, save this and go to our app, and as you can see we now have hello world in the input. Okay, so now let's talk about how to use property binding on custom components. So I'm going to open a terminal here and create a new component using the Angular CLI. So ng generate component, and I'm going to create a card component. Okay, so I'm going to go to card.component.html, and I'm going to create a basic card here. So okay, so dot card dot body and I'll create a h1 tag with class of title. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use string interpolation here to output the value of a property in the component class. So I'm going to call this property title, and I'm going to do the same thing with the body. I'm going to output body here, and what we can now do is go to the TypeScript file, and I'm going to introduce you to the idea of inputs. Inputs are how Angular components can get data from their parent component. So I'll show you an example here. Type at input, and import that from Angular core up here. and in brackets, type in the property name, the binding property name, which I'll call title, and I'll then assign that to a property called title, which will be of type string. And I'll do the same thing for body. So I can now type in body. And now we have our properties title and body, which we can use in the template as we've done here. So if we save this, save that, and we go back to app component.html, we can now delete this line of code and type in our component, app-card, and save that. If we now go to the web page, we see that there's nothing there. And this is expected because we haven't set the values of title and body, which we have to do from the parent component via property binding. So to do this, we type in the name of the property, so title, and surround that with square brackets, equals, and then here we can type in any valid TypeScript expression. And this can include a string. So I'm going to, in single quotes, type in, this is the title. And I'm going to do the same thing with body. So if I type in body, surround it with square brackets, is equal to, and then in single quotes, type in, this is the body, save that, and if we go to our application, we can see we are getting, this is the title, and this is the body. So it's working, right? One thing I want to do quickly is make this look more like a card. So I just want to go to cardComponent.css and just quickly write some CSS. So, okay, so I've just written some very basic CSS code here that makes this component look more like a card. Okay, so let's get back to property binding. Let me explain why we need to put these strings in single quotes here. So right now we have this string encapsulated by double quotes and single quotes as well. And the reason this is because when we do property binding using square brackets around the attribute name, Angular is expecting a TypeScript expression. So we can achieve this by surrounding a string in quotes and using it as a TypeScript expression. And that's perfectly valid. So what if we took away these single quotes? So what would happen is the application would crash, and we can see in the console that we get a template pass error. So this is because Angular is expecting a TypeScript expression, and right now it's trying to find an object with the name, this is the title. That's essentially what it's trying to do. We can see this quite clearly if we change this to just this, and we save that and create a property in the component class called this, and set it to a string equaling test. Save this and go back to the application, and we can see that test is now printed out in the title. Okay, so whenever we do property binding with square brackets around the attribute name, Angular is expecting an object or TypeScript expression. So we can put whatever property we want here, and as you can see, it will then pass in the value of that property. And that's why we need to surround strings in single quotes. So this, in single quotes, will now print out this, as you can see here. But one issue here is it doesn't look very nice. So what we can do is we can actually remove these square brackets here and remove these single quotes. If we save that and go back to the application, as we can see, we now get this as the title. So we can set this as this is the title. Save that and go back to application, and it works, right? So that's an interesting thing about Angular property binding, is that we don't actually need the square brackets. So when we don't use the square brackets, as we have done here, Angular is expecting a string. You can also pass in a number, for example, and that would work because JavaScript can pass that number into a string. So Angular is expecting something that it can pass into a string. Okay, so that was the basics of property binding in Angular. Okay, so we've learned how to bind properties to HTML attributes, such as the disabled attribute on the button HTML element and the value property on the input HTML element. And we've also learned how to do property binding on custom components using @input here, and property binding to bind to those inputs here. Okay, so that's it for property binding. It's a very simple concept, but a very powerful one, because it means we can now pass data from parent component to child component, and that's a very powerful concept in Angular, and will enable you to build very rich, reusable components. Now let's talk about event binding. We often need to program our application to react to user interactions, and we can use event binding to achieve this. A few examples of when events are fired are when a user clicks a button or presses a key on the keyboard. With event binding, we have the option to call methods in the component class when an event gets fired. So I'm going to start coding and show you a few examples. So I'm going to go to my project here that I've just created and go to app component HTML. Let's delete all this placeholder content, and I'm going to create a button that says click me, and I'm going to attach an event handler to this. So in brackets I'm going to type in click, and in speech marks I'm going to type a method name. So I'm going to call this onButtonClick and save that and go to the component class. We can delete this and we can create a method called onButtonClick, and we can show an alert that says you just clicked a button. Save that and we can serve this in the command line. We can do ngserve to serve our application. Okay, so once the live development server is up and running, we can go to localhost 4200, and we have our button here that we have defined in our template, and when we click the button we now get an alert that says you just clicked a button. So we have just created an event handler and attached that event handler to the click event on this button. So we can put any code here and it will run when we click this button here. So if I do console.log hello world, that will now run when I press this button. So I'm going to inspect and go to the console, and when we click this button we now see hello world is printing to the console. So we can attach events to any valid HTML event on HTML elements such as button. Okay, so we're going to go to the template and we're going to create another event listener, and we're going to attach it to the mouse over event, and we're going to say on button mouse over, and in the component class we're going to create this method like that, and here we can do an alert saying mouse over. We now get an alert each time we mouse over this button. There we go. Okay, so there's a ton of events that you can listen to, and you can actually find them online by searching HTML events and JavaScript events. So there's a list. Okay, so here's some common HTML events. So change, click, mouse over, which we've just used, key down and load. And you have to bear in mind that when you're working with Angular, you don't need to put the on. So you just put the change or the click or the mouse over, not the on, okay? So for example, on key down, you just put key down, or on mouse out, you just put mouse out. So let's see if we can find a list. JavaScript event lists. Event reference on MDN. This is probably the best reference you can get. And yeah, here we go. So here we have events that don't have on. So here you'd actually use the event name, and because there's no on prefixed. So yeah, you could use scroll, resize, key up, key down, key press, click, And all of these you can use in Angular just by surrounding it in brackets and then calling a method within these speech marks. Okay, so now we can go and try something a bit more advanced. Okay, so let's create an input of type text, and we're going to create a and we can set the value. Actually, we won't set the value. So we have an input of type text, and then I'm going to create a button, and on click of this button, I'm going to say on click, and I'm going to go to the component class. I'm going to delete these methods here and create on click. And here what I want to do is I want to basically create a mini form, and on click I want to get the value of this input and print it out to the console. So I want the input value, which will be of type string, and I want to do a console.log input value. But we have to find a way to pass in this input value to the onClick method in this event handler. So what we can do is we can create a template reference on the input by just calling it hashtag input. So that will create a template reference variable called input that we can now use in our code. So we can put here input.value, save that, go to our app, and actually let's say let's put some text in this button here. So let's say click or submit. We can put submit. Save that. Go here, and we have our small little form here, and we can type something in. So I'm going to say hello world, and press submit, and now we get it printed to the console. So whatever text I put in here, I can press submit, and it will then print out to the console. 1, 2, 3, submit, ABC, submit. There we go. So that's how you do something a bit more advanced with the inbuilt events on HTML elements. So now what I want to show you is how to emit events in custom components and listen to them from the parent component. So I'm going to go to the command prompt, and I'm going to type in ngGenerate component, and I'm going to call this name component, and just press enter. And I'm going to go to name.component.html, and I'm going to copy over this code here in app.component.html, paste it here, and I'm just going to add a heading here that says what's your name, and I'm going to add a placeholder to the input, enter name here, save that, and yeah, we can keep the button the same. And in the component class, name.component.ts, I'm going to create an event emitter. Now, let me show you the documentation for parent component listening to child event. So the child component exposes an event emitter property with which it emits events when something happens. The parent binds to that event property and reacts to those events. So we have to create an output property, which is of type event emitter, and we have to use the output decoration. So as you can see in this example here, they have an output here, and they've created a new event emitter with the type that will be emit. So we can now create this. So we can do @output, and that will import from Angular core here. That will import from Angular core, and in brackets we can type in, actually we don't have to type in anything here, we can just leave that empty and then type in the name of the event here. So I'm going to say name submit of type event emitter, and the type string, because the type will be the name, so the name is of type string. So and then we can do that. Actually, no, we can do new event emitter of type string. And there we go. We have to actually import event emitter, apparently. Alright, yeah, okay, so it's done the wrong import here. So we can import this properly by importing it from Angular core. And there we go, that's done. So now, on this button click, so let's create the onClick method here. So onClick, it will get the name of type string, and we will do name submit dot emit, and we now have to emit the value, which will be the name. There we go. And so that's that component done. Now in the child component, we're going to have to create a... Okay, well, let's first delete this. And let's create the component in the app component. So I'm going to do app-name. And that's what we use to get the name component. As you can see here, the select is app name. So that will then create our component. And we can now listen for this event. So the event name is name submit. So if we type in name submit equals, and we can type in a method here. So I'm going to type in on name submit. We can actually now pass in the event parameter. And what the event parameter is it's the data that's sent with the event. So the event emitter, as you can see here, will emit an event with content, with a value. So here we're using string, which is the name. So we are emitting the name with the event, right? So you can think of it as the event data. And Angular uses the $event parameter to hold this data. So save this, and now I'm going to go to appcomponent.ts. And now in appcomponent.ts, I'm going to create the method on name submit. And it's going to take in a name, which is the event data. Actually, we can just use this. And then we can do an alert, and we can type in name. So what we've just done here is we've created a new component called name. And we've just put an input and a button, which says, what's your name? And you have to enter your name in the input box. And when you click the submit button, it will then execute this code here, which will run the onClick method with input.value. So in the name.component.ts, the onClick method will emit an event on the name submit event emitter, which we can listen to in the parent component, which is app.component.html, by typing in the event name, which is name submit, and then executing the onNameSubmit method. And we are passing in the event data using $event, which we can then grab in the component class, app.component.ts, which we are getting name string. So we know that the event data that's being held in the $event variable is name. So we can just type in name string, because we know that's what the event data holds. So we know that the event data, which we are passing in the template, using this $event variable that Angular creates for us to hold our event data, we know that this holds the name because we just created a custom component which emits the name, which is of type string. So we in the app.component.ts, the parent component class, we can just type in name string because we know what data is being sent back, and then we can do alert name here just to show you that it works. So save this now and go to our app, and it says what's your name, and I'm going to type in Andy, submit, and we get an alert that says Andy. There we go. So we can type in anything here, and we can now get this value back. So yes, that's how event binding works in custom components. One last thing that I forgot to show you was how the $event variable is used with inbuilt HTML JavaScript events. So, for example, if I create an input here, and I attach the event change, and I say on input change as the method that we called. So if you go to app.ts and create the method on input change, and we want to get the event of type any, and if you want to console log this event, save that and pass in the $ event here. Okay, so let's save this and go to our app. And okay, so now we have this text box here, and each time the value of this changes, we should get a console log of the event object. So I'm going to type in ABC and click out of it. Okay, so now we have this event object come up in the console. If we open it up, we can see some of the fields in this object. And yeah, so we so type change, timestamp, the return value. The target means the element in which the event originated from, which is this input here, and that's why the target is input. Okay, so we have all of this information available to us whenever we bind to an event on a HTML element. We've gone through all the major features of event binding, including how to bind to DOM events, as well as how to bind to events on our own custom components. We've gone through string interpolation, property binding, and event binding. These are all methods of one-way data binding, but what if you wanted to have two-way data binding? So now let's talk about two-way data binding in Angular using ngModel. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new Angular project. So ngNew, ngModel, example. Alright, so once that's been created, I'm going to change directory into that project folder, and I'm going to open it in a code editor. Then I'm going to go to the source folder and go to app and app.component.html, and I'm going to delete this content here, and I'm going to create an input of type text, and I'm going to now use the ngModel syntax here to bind this input to a property in our component class. So we're going to use square brackets and then normal brackets and then type in ngModel and then make that equal to the name of a property, which I'm going to call username. And now in the component class, I'm going to create the property username. Okay, so we've now created that property. So now we can save this and save the template, and let's serve this now. So terminal and ng serve. So now we can go to localhost 4200, and we don't see anything here. Oh yeah, and that's because we're going to get an error, and we can't bind to ngModel because it's not a known property of input, and that's because we haven't imported the forms module. So now let's go to app.module.ts and let's import the forms module. And we can import it in this array here. There we go. If we save that now, we now get the input here and we don't get the error here. Cool. So now we can now type something into here and nothing really happens. So to probably test this out, we should probably show this property within the UI somewhere. So let's go back to our template, and here let's create a heading that says your username is. Then with string interpolation we can now put in username. So now that will be showing the property username in the heading tag. So save that. And now this should work, and it should show up when we type something in here. Is test. So there we go. We now have two-way data binding. So now whenever we type something into the text box, it instantly updates the property which is in the component class, and we can then grab that and show it in the UI. So testing, hello world, it's all instantly updating. So that was a very basic example of how to achieve two-way data binding in Angular. Alright guys, so we are nearing the end of this video. So let's go over what we've learned. So the main thing that we've learned today is how to manage the flow of data from the component class to elements in the view, which can either be a HTML DOM element or a custom component which you've created that will either use an @input or @output to take in or omit data. And that is very, very useful because it allows us to build very rich and reusable components, which when combined together build a really, really maintainable application. Alright then, so that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them down in the comments below, and I will answer them as soon as possible. See you next time.